Purinton. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Dr. Purinton, and then I'll tell you my feelings about him, because he is an absolutely amazing colleague. Dr. Purinton, he is the Associate Provost for International and Strategic Initiatives at AUC. I don't know if you know what a provost is. A provost is the Dean of Deans. This is an American academic position in an American university. We don't have this in the Egyptian universities. I'm in the Al-Umada. But Dr. Purinton is not only the associate provost, but he will be the dean of the Graduate School of Education in July, inshallah, and congratulations for that. Now, Dr. Purinton has his PhD from the University of Southern California, and his area of specialization is policy and administration. And he also got his bachelor and master's degrees from the California State University in the United States. What is really special about Dr. Purinton is his experience. It's really fascinating. Do you know he started as a high school teacher, and then he also worked in the school state district, which is like in Egypt, al-Idara al-Ta'limiyya. And then, not only that, he also worked as a researcher in a specialized research and technical agency. So he has been through so many areas in education. And so we're very lucky to have him at AUC. Not only has he done all of these work experiences in education in the United States, he also, I don't know how, he found time to publish. I don't know how you did that. He wrote 2 books on 6 degrees of school improvement, empowering a new profession of teaching. I love that. And making sense of social networks in schools. These are just books. Of course, he's written lots and lots of articles and research papers. Now, this is his professional background. Now, I also have the honor and privilege of working with Dr. Purinton. We serve together on the Dean's Council, and he is one of the most creative colleagues I ever have worked with. And that's why the title of his presentation, Creativity, is so apt. It is actually him. A very creative colleague with lots of beautiful and lovely ideas. And with his background in policy and administration, he has helped AUC restructure and do much better at the senior level of administration, and I believe that. And so I think we are all excited and waiting to hear about how we, in families and communities, how can we support creativity. I'm very excited, and once again, thank you for accepting the invitation. It's a real honor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and good evening to everybody. My background is, let me just explain a bit more so you know how I'm thinking about creativity. My research and my teaching is in what's called organizational theory. What I do is I study how schools and universities as organizations work. There's a science to it. In fact, there are journals and books and degree programs in organizational theory. And the idea is that just like physics or medicine, where there are certain properties that are consistent, and if you study the properties of physics, for example, you can apply that to multiple situations in the field of physics. The same is true in organizations, in schools and universities. We see similarities across schools and universities all throughout the world. We see those similarities in companies, in families, in communities, and so that's what I study. And I study this so that I can understand how we can improve schools and universities and make them more functional, better places to work, learn, and enjoy. Because schools and universities should be enjoyable. Unfortunately, very, very often they're not. So that's where I'm coming from, and that's the background. Let me explain a little bit more about this, and this is what frames my entire presentation. What I study is through the lens of, it's a long, complicated word, and I'll explain it, neo-institutional theory. And the idea of this is that institutions, the institution of a school, the institution of marriage, the institution of religion, the institution of a government, an institution is something in our head that tells us this thing, this school or this university should be a certain way. It's kind of like my daughter. I have an 8-year-old daughter, and for many years, 8 years, I've given her ice cream cones. That's sort of her, reward at the end of the week. We go to a little ice cream shop, and she has the ice cream that dribbles all over. It's in a cone, and it gets everywhere, and it's a mess. And there was this one time she was wearing something nice, and so my wife and I thought, no, we'll just give it to her in a cup. So we asked for it in a cup with a spoon, and she looked at it and said, well, that's not ice cream. I'm not eating that. That's not ice cream. I think of ice cream as the thing that's messy and gets everywhere and it's in a cone. It's kind of a strange way to think about it, but schools and an ice cream cone are sort of the same thing. We expect certain things out of schools, and we expect certain things out of universities. When you show up to a university, you think, I'm going to take classes, and in those classes I'm going to listen to lectures, I'm going to take notes, I'm going to go home, I'm going to study in the textbook, I'm going to memorize some things, I'm going to go back, I'm going to take a test, and that's what school is. But what happens if you go into your university and things are a little different? The classroom is arranged in a different way where you're not just looking at the professor, but you're in tables discussing things with your colleagues. Or the professor says, there's no tests. You're just going to write papers and tell me what you think. You're not going to tell me what I think or what I've presented to you. You're going to tell me what you think. These are all things that kind of make us uncomfortable because they are not part of the institution of a university. In part, this theory comes from the philosopher Plato. The idea is that there's a reality, a true existence, an existence that we see, and then there's an ideal existence. So the idea of a table is in our heads. It's got 4 legs, maybe it has 3, maybe it has 5, but it has legs, it has a flat surface, and it's just a principle that stays in our mind. But we have all sorts of kinds of tables. Around here we have a few, and out there's a few more. They look different. They serve different purposes. They're different. Plato says that the real table is the ideal one. Everything else is just an imitation of that. And I think a lot of neo-institutional theory comes from that we have this thing in our head. Now, what is different about what Plato said is that we don't have it in our heads from an original perspective of humanity. We have it because we experience these things. We watch a movie and we see, before we even get to the university, we see what it's going to be like from maybe a portrayal of a university. Before we even have ice cream, we might see that on a TV show. We get a sense of all of these institutions from culture, from society, from what people tell us. So it makes it very, very difficult for us to do things that are different. And sometimes when we do things different, we're perceived as being harmful, problematic, troublesome, difficult, sometimes stupid, sometimes not very bright, sometimes just, not moving in the direction that we should be moving in. So I'm going to take just a short pause from the framework of neo-institutional theory and talk about some mental habits, some things that we want schools and universities and families and communities to shape in citizens and employees, students, and so forth. And in this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a little bit about, first, why I think, unfortunately, even though we say we want creativity, in fact, I think we do everything to prevent it. And then I'm going to share with you some ideas about how we can actually promote it and be very deliberate about being creative people, and especially, since my perspective is coming from the educational realm, what we can do in schools and universities and our families to encourage it. So before I get to creativity specifically, I want to talk about a variety of things that we expect schools, universities, and families to do for children, youth, and students. This list comes from Costa and Calic. It's a very famous list of mental habits that we would really like to see all students achieve. Now, obviously, as you'll see as I go through this list, a lot of this does not happen consistently. It doesn't happen as a product or a process of schools and universities. But these are the things that we really do want to see in people, and we value people who have all of these skills. Persistence, being able to stick with something and not give up and know that even though it's not going to work right now, it will have possibly, if we keep at it, a value at the end. Managing impulsivity. This is maturity. We, as children, we, can't control ourselves. We want to run around and act crazy, but over time as we mature, we begin to understand ourselves and how to control our own emotions and our own impulses. Empathy, thinking about how others are perceiving things, thinking about what other people and other groups, other nationalities, other religions, other cultures, other families, other communities perceive and how they feel about circumstances. Flexible thinking, knowing that when something isn't going right, you can switch and try something different and you're not stuck. You can be flexible with how you're doing things in work or in school or in life. Metacognition. Metacognition is recognizing your own thinking about your own thinking. And so what metacognition is, if we are good at metacognition, we think about, well, did I think through the process thoroughly enough? And when I thought through the process, did I impose any of my prior beliefs on it, or did I start to think about it from different perspectives? Metacognition is something we want in citizens because it helps us be more intellectual. It helps us think about things more analytically. Accuracy is another one. We want people to be accurate, even though I'm going to suggest that creativity sometimes is perceived as being the opposite of accuracy. We still do want it. We want to make sure that when people, produce reports in our companies or develop projects in schools or relay information on a test at the university, that they're accurate, and that's important. Questioning, that you don't just accept knowledge as is, or you don't just accept an idea as given, that you'll question it, and you know how to question it. You don't question it blindly, you question it with thoughtfulness, applying past knowledge, recognizing things you've learned in the past and applying it to things in the future or the present. Clarity of thought, clarity of speech, clarity of writing. Gathering data, how to collect information from different sources, different surroundings, different people. Responding with wonderment. This is kind of interesting. I hadn't thought about before this list that this would be a good mental habit. But recognizing what is really incredible and being excited about it and being happy about it and thinking about things with awe. Taking responsible risks. Not just taking any risk, but being responsible about it and knowing how to be responsible about and what is a responsible risk. Finding humor. This is, again, something that we don't always think about as being the mark of an educated person. But I think in society and in culture, we do recognize that people who can recognize humor are definitely more easy to get along with, and they're more adaptable. Thinking interdependently, not independently on your own, but thinking about how things work between groups and different interests and different ideas and how those things connect. And then finally on this list, remaining open to continuous learning, recognizing what you don't know and knowing how to think about finding that out. And then the last one is creativity, imagination, and innovation. So that's the long list. And if you're ever curious about that, again, let me just go back. It's Costa and Calic, and you can find this. If you just type in those names on Google, you'll find this list and descriptions of this everywhere. It's been around for, I think, about 20 or so years. I kept the last one as creativity because I'd like to discuss this in greater depth. Thinking about how something can be done differently than what is normal, accepted, or historical. Proposing new ideas and striving for originality. Creativity is something that we value in educated people because it takes us away from what is and shows us what can be. There's only one. Before I get to why is it valued? Why do we care about it so much? Why do we think about it so much? And why do we want it? Why do we talk about it in schools and universities? Why do we want our children to be creative? Why do we want people in our companies, employees, to be creative? On one level, it's heroic. We think about creative people as the people who made major breakthroughs, the people who were innovative scientists who decided to not let go of crazy ideas, but then they ultimately end up with really interesting discoveries. Or people leading companies. I mean, the one person everybody thinks about these days as being a creative entrepreneur, who broke boundaries in technology was Steve Jobs. That's a good example. There are a lot of other people I can think of, but he's somebody that everybody knows as being creative and saying, well, we don't have to do it the way it's been done before, and I know I'm going to look crazy if I keep working at this project for years and years and years with no immediate result. And he became a hero, and people like that are heroic. Artists, painters, musicians. Anyone who does something really different and it becomes a trend, we think very highly of these people. It's also valued because it creates new value. It opens up opportunities to sell new products, to make more money, to do things that people find to be interesting and worthy of expending time, energy, and money. An odd example is restaurants. When you think about a restaurant that's been around for 20 or 30 or 40 years doing the same thing, the same way, year after year after year, there's one of two reactions we have. Either they do it really, really well and there's no reason to change it, or it's just there and people think about it as, a place you can go, but there's nothing truly exciting about it. I see a lot of restaurants opening up. You don't see a really simple restaurant opening up anywhere. You see restaurants that are trying to be different. Restaurants that have taken a recipe and changed it a little bit and maybe done something different with the decor inside. That's because we like new, innovative things. We don't want the same thing, so we find that it provides new value. And then the third one is problem solving. Significant problems in society, in our lives, can be solved with creative thinking. Okay, so this is what it is. But I'd like to now turn this presentation to how we discourage it. Because I think this is more important. Most of us know what creativity is, and we think about it, and we probably want to be more creative, but there's things that hold us back. And I'm going to tie this to my field, organizational theory and neo-institutional theory, and suggest that The reason we discourage it is because we're afraid of taking risks, because we acknowledge that very often creativity yields things that make people upset with us, and perhaps make people think that we're not very bright. We don't know what we're doing. It's not done this way, and what we should be doing is sticking to the way it is, like the ice cream cone. The first one is blind adherence to hierarchy. How many of us have, been in a workplace environment and you recognize, let's say you're not the senior person in your company or your organization, and you recognize that you have ideas that would really make a difference, but because you're not the senior person, nobody's going to listen to you. The people who are above you, who've been in the company longer, are more likely to be listened to. This is not because we necessarily felt that the longer you are around in a company or an organization, the more you necessarily know. Usually it's because that's just the way it's done, that we respect people by giving them higher level positions, higher pay, higher authority, higher respect. And unfortunately, in companies everywhere, in schools and universities all over the place, in governments, in communities, in families, sometimes the youth, sometimes the less experienced people see things more clearly than the people who've been around for a long time. Why is that? Because the longer you've been in something, the more likely it is that you are completely conditioned through those institutional frameworks. And what I'm suggesting here is that when we choose based on our societal or cultural or organizational expectations to provide always more respect and more adherence to authority and seniority, we give up opportunities to learn from people who have fewer institutional constraints. We often think of it as, the more senior people have more of a vested interest in the way things are, but I don't actually think that's necessarily true. I think it's because, like the story of the emperor. Does anybody know this story? The story of the emperor is the one of the entire kingdom not recognizing that the emperor shows up to an event without clothes on. The emperor shows up, and he's walking around completely naked, and all the adults are looking around thinking, what do we say? What do we do? And so instead they just nod because they know that he's the senior figure and he's the authority. And that nobody has the guts to say anything. And it's a little kid who says, why doesn't he have any clothes on? And everybody then is embarrassed because they didn't say anything, and everybody acknowledges it. But the point is that this story shows us that it's not that we are completely blinded to new ideas. Sometimes we feel like we have a responsibility to be quiet, not say anything, and let the authority figures do their thing. The next one is fairly similar to it. Devotion to tradition. It's done a particular way. We've always done it this way, and therefore it has to be this way. And this is, again, related to institutional thinking. Concern for perfection. This is a very serious problem. And I see it in schools and universities everywhere. That what we really want is to be accurate. Remember, that was on that list, and I said that it was perceived to be opposite from creativity. What we want is accuracy. What we want is a complete picture of knowledge. We want it presented the way that it's been presented in the lectures and the textbooks. We want things to be perfect. Life isn't perfect. And certainly most novel outcomes did not go through a perfect process. Most inventions are messy. Most breakthroughs did not come across well at the beginning of the process. And when we are expecting perfection all the time, we end up in a cycle of fear that perhaps being creative is a bad idea. Bad idea for our career, bad idea for our educational outcomes, bad idea for our social interactions. The next one, priority of professions. This is an interesting thing that I think I'd like to spend a little time talking about, because I think it's very endemic and problematic in this country in particular. When we think about the things that we want to do as a university student and in our careers, we think of the top professions. We think of things in terms of their professional standing and their professional bodies. Engineering, medicine, so forth, academia. And very often those professions themselves are constrained by such deep, deep institutional problems, deep institutional frameworks. When we get our own students to think about what they want to do as adults, the kinds of things that we want to push them into doing, and they have to get certain test scores and go to certain universities in order to become those things. What we're doing is we're saying, there's a pathway, follow it. And if you don't follow it, then something's wrong with you. And unfortunately, this, I think, has a huge, huge negative consequence on how we treat education, and in turn, just like everything else institutional, we hear it, we experience it, and so we do it to our own kids. And that's a really stressful thing to let go, because how many of us want to say, you know what, don't worry about your test scores, your grades. Don't worry about where you go to the university. Be creative. Go forward and just have fun and experiment. Nobody wants to do that. I don't want to do that with my own children. But unfortunately, we put them on a path that has very clear markers. Year by year, step by step, we know what they're supposed to do. They know what they're supposed to do. And they unfortunately do it because that's what they're supposed to do. And I think what we need to be doing more of instead is saying, okay, what do you want to do? How do you want to proceed? It's a very hard thing to let children and youth think about, because, as we all know, they don't always make good decisions. My 8-year-old daughter tells me, some really crazy things about what she wants to do with her life. Obviously, she's not thinking straight. I have to help, and my wife has to help set her on a path. But unfortunately, again, those pathways are constrained by professions, by ways of moving towards achieving those things. And unfortunately, it's too lockstep and too linear. And the final one is standardization and equity. And I want to think about this in terms of both what happens in schools and what happens in our own families. Standardization in terms of curriculum, testing, going to university, pursuit of professions, but also equity in terms of ensuring that everybody has the same levels of opportunity. And this is a very difficult concept, because right now, what many of us in most countries are thinking about is the inequities, economic inequities, social inequities. And what we really want to make sure is that we provide things for everybody. And unfortunately, we've seen in societies that move in that direction that we end up with less and less creativity, because people aren't permitted to fail. They are, again, given a path, and they're supposed to follow it. And unfortunately, that yields some very negative consequences. If we were to develop creativity more, if we were going to encourage it and help our own children, our students, our own selves be more creative, we need to remove barriers. We need to think about how we desire conformity far too much. We need to think about what is important in tradition and what's not important in tradition. And in fact, this is, I would say, something that we can be very deliberate about in terms of metacognition. I've thought about this quite a bit. I'm American. I've lived here in Egypt for 4 years. And there are certain holidays that we don't really celebrate in Egypt that were very common in the U.S. One of them is Mother's Day. We do celebrate it here, but on a different date. And that's a problem for me as a husband, because I forget both the Egyptian one because I'm not used to that, and I forget the American one because there's nobody on TV telling me, get your wife a Mother's Day card and buy her a present. And so I end up, every year making that mistake. But I also think about things like, most people around the world know about American Thanksgiving. And it's kind of a hard one for somebody who doesn't, who's not around, people from their own country, because we celebrate it with, a smaller gathering and so forth. And my wife and I asked ourselves, what is important? Out of this tradition, we used to just show up every year to the same gathering at a family member's house. Every year, we brought the same food. We ate the same food. We did the same thing. It was automatic. We didn't even have to ask, what time does it start? We knew 1 p.m., everybody shows up, and you bring the same dish you bring every single year. We had to ask ourselves, does that really matter? And it turned out that we agreed it does matter, and so we still decided to celebrate it. But we had to be very deliberate about it. And we had to think about it as something that maybe some traditions are not worthwhile following. That one is, and so we do that. But I think that's something that we all have to ask ourselves. What is it? What are the traditions that we follow? What are the traditions that we think about too deeply? And what are the traditions that end up preventing us from doing things a little differently? Ethical interpretations. This is a constraint that I think we have to start asking. This is about metacognition. It's about thinking about, how did we perceive something to be an ethical or a moral issue? And does it have to be that way? Maybe it does. But the point is, we have to ask ourselves that. And we have to think about, when we're creative, we're going to break traditions, we're going to break boundaries, and we have to ask ourselves, is that okay? Sometimes it's not. But by just accepting that something has to be a particular way, we're losing opportunities. Mental models, and this is back to the idea of institutionalism. We have to remove those barriers and think about, what it is that got stuck in our head long time ago. Lack of knowledge. A lot of people think of creativity as, sort of the antithesis or the opposite of pure, straight, clarified knowledge. Because we think of knowledge as just the way it is, and creativity is taking it further or doing something different with it. But I think most people actually are unable to be creative because they didn't read enough, they didn't think enough, they didn't explore enough, they didn't expose themselves enough to ideas. I think about a lot of the things that I do in my own job. When I try to be creative, but I don't do the research about how those traditions or those constructs were developed, I end up proposing some really, really bad ideas because I'm not thorough with my thinking. And then the last one, fear of risk. We have to remove that. And I'll discuss more about how to do that in just a moment. Then the next one is divergent and convergent thinking. Divergent thinking is like brainstorming. And there is a risk with brainstorming, by the way. But divergent thinking is just exploring a multitude of ideas and trying to get as many ideas out on the table as possible. We think of this as brainstorming, and most of us think of brainstorming as a really good thing. Unfortunately, brainstorming has actually shown in research to be very problematic. And here's why. How many of us, when we just think of all sorts of ideas, just, we're not being held on some level of restriction. We don't have some framework that's reining us in and keeping us from just putting ideas down on paper or sharing them in a meeting. There is a level of creativity that actually is beneficial when we are exposed to criticism. And I think about this in terms of when I come up with ideas at work, or especially when I write things. I often end up feeling compelled to write comments on online news articles. And I don't know why. I should stop doing that because I usually don't think about it too long. I might get emotional about something I read on a news article, and if there's a comment feature, I'll type up a comment, and then I'll check back later and see that 20 people criticized what I just wrote. And here it is, my name is on there, and I said something that I regret writing later on, and then I try to see, can I erase it? No, it's there permanently. And that's actually a beneficial thing. I actually think that this is something that we should welcome and find ways to put ourselves in these positions more often. So on the one hand, I'm being creative, and on the next, I'm getting a lot of criticism. There's a big difference between the fear and the opportunity to express our thoughts. I express my thoughts. Those news articles, allow me to do that. So I have the freedom to do it. And oftentimes newspapers or news sites online put those things in there to get people more engaged in the information. But when I do that, I take a risk because my name is on there and other people might look at the crazy things I wrote. But if I don't do that, I'm just engaging in divergent thinking. I'm just in my head, perhaps, thinking, this is a bad idea, this is a good idea, I wish the writer said this, I don't like this thought, this idea is really good, but I'm not held accountable to anything. When I put it on paper, I'm held accountable to it, and that sharpens my creative thinking, because I'm then exposed to criticism that gives me feedback and helps me refine those thoughts. And that's really where convergent thinking comes in. So yes, it's good to have divergent thinking. It's good to just put ideas out on the table. Divergent thinking is saying, all right, well, we'll take all those ideas and we'll try to combine them together and come up with something productive. And in many ways, this is the process of creativity. We think about all the possible ways of doing something, all the potential outcomes. We consider lots of ideas, and then we ask ourselves, what won't work? We need knowledge for that. What could be combined with something else? How can we put these ideas that normally don't go together? And then expose it to the public, expose it to colleagues, expose it to teachers, expose it to professors. So these are some ideas about how to develop it. Pursuing new experiences, collaborating, reading, mental discipline. So now I'd like to talk about what is most important to me. How do we develop this in children and youth? And I think about this not just for myself as an educator and a parent, but I think about it also for myself because I know I'm still developing as a creative person and I want to be innovative. I want to expand how I think about things. And so all of these things can be applied to 1-year-old children and 40-year-olds, 20-year-olds in different ways. So I'm going to go through each of these. These are what I would say are specific steps that can be used. And the way that I'm going to frame this is in terms of parenting and teaching. But again, it can be applied to any way. Unstructured play. As parents and teachers, we often want our students and our children and our youth to have structured opportunities because if we unstructure those things, then we think, well, anything could happen. I felt really guilty last weekend. I had a lot of work to do on Friday afternoon, and my daughters really, really wanted to play with me. They wanted to, have me read books. They wanted to, they have board games they wanted to play. They wanted to, ride around on their little scooters. They wanted to do all sorts of things that I had to be part of. I was too busy. I had something to finish, and I said, you know what? I'm really sorry, but if you let me finish this tomorrow, Saturday, I'll spend time with you. I just have to work on this. I felt so horrible because I was leaving them just to their own devices. Turned out that it didn't really matter. They were so busy. They had, they were left on their own. I pulled out all the toys, got everything out for them. Normally everything's in cabinets. I want everything to be clean and nice because I'm picky that way. But I pulled everything out and I thought, well, if everything is a complete disaster, all the Legos, all the toys are all over the place, that's fine. Just for today because I don't have time. It turned out they didn't want to stop playing. They were mimicking different characters. They were building things. It was actually, I think, better to give them that freedom to explore, to play, to do things. At times they started to fight with each other. But interestingly, they worked it out on their own because I just ignored them. And this, I think, was something that I don't do too often. And so they sort of took advantage of it and had a lot of fun. But I think ultimately what happened was that they ended up realizing they had to do their own thing. There was no parent that was going to, walk them through a board game or read a book to them or anything else like that. They had to do it on their own. And it was really a valuable opportunity. We don't do this as parents very often because we feel like we might be ignoring our children, or we might be allowing them to just sort of wither on their own. We certainly don't do this in schools or universities. How often, do we just let students in primary school just explore and play with ideas? We don't do that because we have a curriculum to teach. Unstructured play gives children opportunity to experiment, to mimic, to model, to collaborate. And the unfortunate thing is that we have to help even train our own children to be productive, unstructured players. Sometimes we just don't know how to do that because, I don't know about you, but it's very hard for me to just even sit still. The first thing I do when I'm sitting still for a few minutes is I check my phone, I look at my email. It's very difficult for us to do this because we're always in the habit of being entertained by some device or somebody else. Unstructured play. The next one is providing the resources for creating, building, and experimenting. This really goes along with the idea of unstructured play. Even though it's an investment, it's a cost investment, ensuring that children and youth at all ages have physical materials to play with, not screens, physical materials to play with, has been shown to be very instrumental in brain development, especially at early ages. This is why, interestingly, we think of mathematics learning, for example, as being pencil and paper, chalkboard. But the best learning of mathematics it comes with manipulating objects. Because for some strange reason, there's a connection between the hand, the brain, and that neurological experience between the two that allows children who especially struggle with the cognitive aspects of mathematics to pick it up really quickly. I'm a perfect example of that. I've always struggled with mathematics. When I was in college, and by the way, I had a really hard time with it throughout my entire school career, but when I got to the university, I took a statistics class where the professor allowed us to, he brought all sorts of objects, everything from game pieces to little origami pieces of paper that were created into little objects. And we were supposed to manipulate these and move them around and to trade them and do different things with each other. And the purpose of that is to help us think about how the mathematical cognitive concepts are related to what we're doing physically. And it was an incredible experience for me. I learned how to do mathematics from that. But it also is an opportunity. For example, there are a couple times where I thought it was sort of strange that my daughters, especially on Friday, well, one of them in particular, had these two little figures, these people figures, these little toys, and she was mimicking people talking with each other. And what was going on in the conversation was that one of these little figures was making fun of the other, and the other was yelling back at the one making fun. I was a little concerned about it because it kind of sounded strange to me. And I asked about that. Well, why are you talking that way? Why are you making your toys be so mean to each other? Turns out somebody was mean to her the previous day at school. And she was reenacting it. She didn't have the courage at school to talk back to the boy that was making fun of her. But with those little toys, she was able to do it. I don't know if that will affect what happens next time somebody makes fun of her at school. But I do know that she was unable to articulate a response to that boy at school because she was on the spot. She was scared, she was upset, she was hurt. But when she had the freedom and the flexibility to say, you know what, I'll just, reenact this, and now I'll start to share my anger and my frustration with this boy for doing it, she was able to articulate it in a really nice way, in fact. And we were able to talk about it. These things don't happen when we have too much structure, but they also don't happen when we don't give children the opportunity to have something physical in their hands to play with. And that goes also for, adults. And so, especially when, I think about my years of teaching high school. I taught English literature, English composition, and it's very difficult to find ways of doing things with physical manipulatives in high school, with teenagers. But I found that, giving people a little bit of opportunity to, even shape physically an idea before they write it out gives them a better sense of what to do. Here's another idea. My daughter is trying to convince me to have a pet. First, she wanted to have a dog. I said, no, I don't want a dog. Then she wanted to have a cat, and I said, well, I'm allergic to cats, we can't have a cat. So now she's trying to convince me that she could have something in a cage, like a mouse. I don't want a mouse at all. So she's now convincing me a gerbil or a little rodent, like a rodent that would be just sort of a hamster, yeah. So, she's arguing with me like, well, I'll take care of it. It'll be fine. And by the way, I know all these things about hamsters and gerbils, and they're really great pets. And I told her the other day, I'm not going to do it because I'm not convinced. But if you really want to try to convince me, what I want you to do is think about what I'm thinking. The things that I'm worried about. So together, what we did was, I said, why don't you come up with a list of things that I'm worried about, and then come up with a response, and then write me a letter. So what she did was she came up with all the things that she realized I would be upset about. So I said, we'll create the space that the hamster or the gerbil would live in. Show me what it would be like. Show me how much food physically it will take to feed a hamster for 1 month, and see if you have enough money to buy that from the pet store. So she had to look up in a book how much a hamster or a gerbil eats in 1 day, and then figure out what that looks like over the course of a month. So we did that with little pieces of crumbled up paper, so she could see how big of a bag of food she would need. Now, she's still in the process of doing this, and we're going to work on this for the next few days. But the idea is to give her a chance to think through, how do I convince my dad to buy me a pet? And I will go along with it. I just have to say, I will get it if she convinces me. And this is, I think, a way to help her think through argumentation, persuasion with me, and hopefully in a creative and innovative way. But it's because she has resources. A creative atmosphere. One of the things that is so discouraging to me when I walk into school or university classrooms is to see blank walls that are colorless. Walking into, bedrooms of children, and there's nothing on the walls, there's no art, there's no stimulation visually. Being in a room for a whole day and not having any music. These kinds of things stimulate us and make us happy to be in our physical environments, and they stimulate our thought. And when we don't do these things, when we instead say, what we are here for in school is to study and to memorize and to do good with our studies, and therefore we're not interested in putting up art on the walls or having music in the background or taking some time to talk about what we saw on our way to school today, then I think we send the message that creativity actually is not really valued because we don't take the time or the thought or the energy to make it part of our lives and our existence. The next one, don't be bossy. This is a really hard one for me as a teacher and a parent. I'm the adult. I'm the teacher. I'm the parent. I know what's best. And it's really hard for me to say, I'll step back and let her make some mistakes, or let her kind of run the show, or let my students make decisions. This was one of the hardest things for me to do, but I knew I had to do it because I'd been reading a lot about this before I became a teacher. When I started teaching, I was working in a school in Los Angeles that was very troubled. Immense poverty, gangs, violence, so forth. It was a very classic inner city school when you think of, if you know anything about the United States, just a lot of gang violence, drugs, things like that, a very negative environment. But I wanted to teach in an environment like that for a couple of years, just to experience it. And it was really hard because, I wanted to be a creative, innovative teacher, but everybody else in the school thought it was best to be strict because these children don't know how to behave. You have to tell them how to behave, and you have to have very severe, very strict rules. And I decided instead, what I'm going to do is be a little bit more open and free and give students an opportunity to talk with each other. Give them an opportunity to come up with some of the rules that we'll use in our classroom. Now, I have to say, when I started doing it, it was a disaster. Horrible disaster. It was so bad that there were students yelling at each other. There was chaos everywhere. I learned after a few years of this that there were better ways of doing it, and that's what I meant by risk-taking and responsible risk-taking. I did learn how to do it, and I was able to continue doing it because I felt that was a responsibility of mine to not let that idea go. But it took a while to figure that out. But the point of it was that I really wanted to make sure that when kids walked into the classroom, they knew that it wasn't just my knowledge or the book's knowledge that was important, but that we could all think about what things mean and come up with ideas all together. Now, that's a very strange concept for most people in schools. But it took a lot of effort for me to figure out how not to tell them what to do, tell them how to do it, but let them come up with ideas themselves. I had to not be bossy. And one of the ways I did that was to say, one of the things that will, you don't have complete freedom to do whatever you want, but at least you can help me come up with what the rules will be. I decided to do that recently with my own children. In particular, their table manners, slouching on the table, just shoving their food in their mouth, acting really, spilling things, not very appropriate table manners. And I know they're young, but, I feel like it should, be something that they think about and that we could work on some of those things. So my wife and I came up with a list of rules. That didn't go very well. It lasted for about one day. We got so tired of yelling at them and getting mad at them. And we said instead, okay, how about you come up with 3 things you think are important and you'll work on those for the next 2 weeks. They came up with them each. They had a different list. I have a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old. They came up with different things. But the point was, and it worked. The point is that they were given the flexibility to come up with things on their own. And because we gave them that freedom, they took it. The next one is something that educators talk about all the time, but I don't think we do enough of it. And especially it's hard when we have so many electronic gadgets everywhere and we have so much in society that takes us away from reading. Reading is so important. Fiction and nonfiction, news and opinion and everything. Just reading voraciously helps us to be creative. I'm a professor, and I do as much writing as I possibly can. And there are times where I feel like I have 4 hours today to write. Perhaps I'm going to try to write 2 or 3 pages of an article. So I'm just going to get right to it. I'm going to start writing. And I really find that when I do that, either I don't end up writing much at all, or what I write is very bad. I found instead that if I say I have 4 hours and I'm going to spend 2 hours reading about the topic that I'm writing about, and then I spend 2 hours writing, I'll actually get more done in those 2 hours than I would if I had not read at all. Reading stimulates our thoughts. It gives us ideas. We learn then to interact with the text, think about how the author presented an idea, consider it in relationship with other ideas we have. Reading is so important, and in many ways, if we as parents or teachers don't model that for our own students and children, we know for certain that they're not going to do it on their own. Now, I have to admit, again, I'm talking a lot about my parenting and my teaching, but I'm just sharing with you all the experiences and mistakes and troubles I've been through. And one of the things that I have had trouble with is encouraging my own children to read. Of course, they just do it on their own because they like to, but I found that, when they would be reading, I would, be writing on my computer, or I'd be doing something in the kitchen or fixing something or watching something on TV or checking my email on my phone. And I realized, what message does that send to them? You're kids, so you should go and read, but I'm going to go check my email. That's not a good role model of how to be intellectual, be thoughtful, and be critical. So what my wife told us all the other day was, we're going to spend every Friday and Saturday afternoon, we're going to spend 30 minutes at home. All 4 of us are going to sit down quietly, no TV on, nothing else going on. We're all going to read together. Well, it didn't work either of those days, but we're going to try it again. Because it didn't work, because as soon as we all sat down, the doorbell rang and somebody came. The phone rang. It was so difficult. But you know what? We're going to keep at it. We're going to keep trying it because we think it's important. When I was a teacher, there was this thing that was really popular in American schools for a while, and I found it to be very useful. It was called Drop Everything and Read. The acronym is DEAR, Drop Everything and Read. It's really hard because I wanted as a teacher to be bossy, and I wanted to make sure every one of my students was reading. The idea is that you just read something fun for 20 minutes a day. And so it's a part of the school or the classroom culture. So you tell people it's important. It's so important that we'll actually take time to do it at school. So we did. But I'd be sitting around. I'd be reading my book, because I'm supposed to be doing that as the model for my students. But really, I wasn't reading. I was, who's not reading? And that attitude, I think, was the wrong attitude, because I know I'm not going to get every single person. I know I'm not going to be perfect with it. And the ones who especially were, causing trouble, not reading, were noticing me. Of course they were looking at me. They're trained to look for the teacher, to see what the teacher is doing. And I think that was a really bad signal for me to send to all those students that, you should be reading, and I'm just going to make sure you read because it's important that you read. That didn't send the right signal. Reading for pleasure. So the next one is limit TV and video games. This is, I think most of us know this. It's very difficult, of course, to make this happen. But there is an enormous amount of research that shows, especially at early ages, that television and video games, computers, screens in general, prevent creative thought. So much so that, interestingly, I saw this study last year that somebody presented at AUC. There was a study of brain activity done at Harvard. These researchers recruited a bunch of students at Harvard to do this study. They would hook up, things to their heads, and it would measure brain activity. with different activities. Everything from sleep to eating to having a discussion to going to class to watching television to exercising. All of those activities, brain activity was really vibrant and vigorous, except for two things: listening to lectures and watching television. Brain activity was flat. And that says to me that, it's really something that we should try to limit as much as possible in children. There are even more studies that show that children who watch a certain number of hours of television per day are more likely to have slower cognitive growth than kids who watch less television. That's a real challenge because sometimes television is a babysitter for those of us who are parents. But we have to be very, very deliberate about reducing that. Permit expression of thoughts. This is also a challenge. As you can see, all of these are challenges because they have pros and cons both ways. We don't always want people to express all of their thoughts because that's not a good mental habit either. We want people to be selective and careful with how they make their arguments and how they state their opinions. And we want them to fit within, whatever circumstance we're in. But sometimes we go overboard on that and we limit expression of thought. We want to try as much as possible to get children, youth, college students, anybody talking about what their thinking is. The more you talk about it, the better your thinking will be. In fact, there are also some studies that show that in writing assessments, for example, if you're going to take a test to get into a university, or you're going to do an exam where you're assessed on how well you construct an argument and you write something, that if you actually can talk it through first, you articulate your thoughts verbally, you're going to statistically have a higher chance of doing better on the assessment. This is a very important thing because we are, by our nature in education, trained to think of thinking as something that goes on only in our head. Most people, I think, recognize that if they are given a chance to talk something through, talking isn't just expressing fact or reality, it's actually the only way we can really start thinking about our own thinking. There's something different that happens when it's out in the open and verbal, when you can hear it yourself, than when it's just in your head. I noticed this myself. Just today, I wrote a proposal for something. And then I thought, well, I better call the person that I'm sending it to and just talk it through because it might not be a good idea, and I better just get their perception first. When I started talking about it, I realized, wow, this is really a bad idea. And it's because I only had talked about it, I had only verbalized it after talking to this person. Now, the second to last one, how to encourage and foster creativity. Don't reward it. Do not reward it explicitly. And this is a really hard thing because when your student in a classroom, if you're a teacher, or your child at home does something really creative and innovative, our first inclination is to say, wow, that's really wonderful. Great, do more of that. What we should be doing instead is, show me how that works. And will it work outside if you do it that way? And is that the right color for this thing you painted? I'm not sure. But that's not the way that we are trained to think about really creative things that come from our children or our employees. When somebody does something really creative at work, we're conditioned to think, let's reward them, give them more money, or promote them, or tell everybody in the office how great they are, because what you think you're doing is you're encouraging more of it. What studies show instead is that you're training somebody to appreciate that external reward. Most of us know in our homes and in our workplaces that it is good to be creative, and it is good to be high performing, and it is good to have people appreciate what you do. And of course, it's important to, get some positive feedback so you know how to move forward. But if all we do is reward it and don't work with it and think about it more explicitly, then we end up training people to go for the reward, not for the result. This is really difficult because most of us feel that any type of criticism or any type of comment that might diminish the excitement of something positive has a detrimental effect on us. Most of the time, however, I think we feel like when somebody is engaging with us about something very specific, even if it sounds slightly critical, that it's a positive experience. We learn from it, we can grow from it, we can do more with it. There are so many studies that show that when children are trained to think about the grade in class or the exam score, that they have completely detached their entire emotional construct from learning. And this is such a damaging thing. And this is truly what I find to be the biggest tragedy in modern formal education. We obviously have to have a way of identifying what quality is in schools and universities. But we've done that with a ranking system, grades or scores, and we train students into going for those things instead of engaging with ideas. Then finally, and this is related to it, emphasize the process, not the product. Not the final outcome, but looking at what was the process that you went through and how could we improve that, and what is it that you did to get to this thing? Of course, you think the product might be good. How did you create that? What did you do? What went through your mind as you were trying to develop this? That kind of engagement gets kids thinking about the importance of process and the dialogue of process. One other thing about rewarding I just want to mention. I've read this a few times, that when you want to reward or at least acknowledge a job well done with children, and probably with employees too, the worst thing you could do is say, you're a good employee, or you're an amazing son or daughter. I think you're incredible. What most psychologists tell us is important is instead be very specific. You did this thing really well, or you were able to accomplish this. You did a great job responding to that kid who was making fun of you. It's those specific things that help kids think about what it is that they're doing in their daily lives, and they reflect on them. To summarize, I think one of the takeaways from all of this is something that can be very frustrating. Very frustrating because we recognize that as much as we want to be creative, like I said at the very beginning of this, most likely we're going to fall back in the traps of being status quo. And the reason that we do that is because of all the things that we've talked about before. Either there's risk, it's not the way that people expect it, there's all sorts of constraints that prevent us from being innovative and creative because of those institutions. And it's very troubling to think about these ideas when we all live in a society, we all work in companies, we all go to schools, or we send our children to schools that think very much differently than what I've presented here. So when I say hold schools accountable for substantive issues, this isn't going to be a very natural conclusion from what I've said, but I'll try to express what I'm thinking here. Very often when let's say, for example, you have the ability to choose a school to send your child, and you think about all the features that you'd like to have in a school. Is there, are the facilities nice? What kinds of extracurricular subjects do they teach? Are the teachers nice to the kids? How many kids are in the class? All of these things are good and important, but they're superficial. Because what happens when, all of those nice features are there when kids get into class? The same thing that's been going on for generations and generations and generations all around the world. Memorization, reliance on factual information, things like that. I think when we are looking at schools and we're questioning where to send our children, we want to ask questions, of course, about facilities and class size, but we also want to ask questions about, well, how are you encouraging creativity? What kinds of things do teachers do in their classrooms to make sure that kids feel valued about experimenting and valued about failing with things? They can try different things and fail and then eventually get to something that is valuable at the end. But instead, I think in schools we encourage failure as a problem. We say that any type of failure is not good. So when we don't look at these things, when we don't ask about these things, when we don't push schools to answer questions about creativity, we end up getting the same thing that we've always gotten. Providing room and flexibility. By this I mean this really, really is a very difficult thing to implement because it means we have to let go of so much. Be willing to allow your children and students to make mistakes. Again, this is really the fundamental basis of creativity. Mistakes that aren't, you don't have to say, oh, great, you tried it and you failed. You're so wonderful. But instead, not getting mad at them for failing. It's a fine distinction. Devolving responsibility. The idea of giving the students in a class the opportunity to come up with some of their own rules. Interestingly, what happened when I did that in that inner city school, when I allowed some of the students to create the classroom rules, when I thought first about coming up with classroom rules, I was teaching middle school, by the way, at this in Los Angeles at this very troubled school. So I had kids who were 12 and 13 years old, a really difficult age. Behavior, and they're crazy. And so when you think of rules for 12 and 13-year-olds, you think about sitting still, being quiet, raising your hand, all the basic things of civility in a classroom. It was really interesting. They didn't come up with they came up with a few of those, but they came up with others. They came up with respecting each other. And I thought, well, that's kind of weird. I just want you to be quiet. I just want you to listen to what I say. But what they had thought about was when they're dialoguing, because they knew that they had, major social issues with one another, both as 13-year-olds and also the fact that there were problems of gangs even within the classroom, where they knew who each other were. I didn't know what gangs they were part of, but they knew. They wanted respect. They wanted to make that a big deal. They didn't care if they were flying around the room on the lights. They wanted respect. And I realized, well, maybe I should just let go of some of these things. Maybe they should be flying around on the rafters and so forth, as long as they were kind to each other and not picking on each other all the time. And when I did that, I realized, okay, so they calmed down a little bit. Some of why they were acting that way was because the lack of respect was a problem to their being. I had to give up that responsibility to them because they knew better what they needed. And that's a very troubling and difficult thing. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to completely blindly give it up, because that's also a problem. And I remember when I was teaching there, that was when most of you many of you might recall, what was it called? Columbine, the shooting of at the high school in Colorado. I can't remember, there were 2 kids, I think, who went into a school and shot a bunch of other kids. And it was that same week, I remember, that I realized when I was in my classroom and there were some students who were pretending to get up and wrestle with each other, or I realized I do have to have limits, and I do have to be very strict on certain things, because we were all kind of scared about what would happen. You can't completely give up everything, but you have to slowly give pieces of it away, and responsibly. And the final thing is listen. And this is, I think, the biggest takeaway. Listening to others, listening to how things are perceived by other people, other groups, other organizations, other ideas, other cultures. This is really, I think, when creativity comes out the most. Because I think, most failed creativity is a result of us feeling like we have complete freedom to do what we want and we can just try and experiment. It doesn't work that way in real life, as we all know. And when we listen, we get ideas, we understand, and we engage in convergent thinking. We put ideas together. Anyway, these are some ideas. I hope this was something that allowed all of us to think a little bit about what we can do in our own lives, in our own workplaces, either with our own children, our students, our employees, or ourselves. And I suppose right now is a good chance to just take questions or comments from anyone, if anybody has any comments or questions. Yes? Do you want to just, since it's a packed room?
Yes, thank you. I'm an English teacher, and I'm asking, how can I teach the students reading, especially in literature, without being bossy?
Teach them what?
Literature. To read novels, drama, and so on. Also grammar, writing, everything without being bossy. How come?
Okay, so that's a really interesting thing, because literature, I think, is an easy one. Grammar is not. And I face this problem as a teacher myself many times, because I taught literature and grammar. Literature, when the great writers write novels or poets write their poetry, they didn't really want us to memorize anything, or they didn't really want us to take tests on their work. They wanted to, they wanted us to, engage with ideas and think and be clever and creative with their thoughts. They wanted us to argue with them. And if we allow students to do that, either through writing or discussion, then we're not being bossy. But there's one problem, and that's that really most students don't really find engagement with a lot of the literature that we choose for them to read. And unfortunately, when we want them to be exposed to the classics, because that's the mark of an educated person, unfortunately, the classics might not be relevant. And so I found that to be really difficult as myself as a teacher. I wanted my students to know Shakespeare, and I wanted them to know Chaucer and all the famous writers, because if they didn't, they really wouldn't come across as educated people in the long run, even though knowing who these people are is not intelligence. It's simply being cultured. So you have to do a little bit of both, I think. And one of the ways that I think we can do this in schools is giving some choice over some literature. One of the things that I find to be really, really painfully difficult when dealing with literature with high school students or college students is the idea of having to get through a long novel or a play, especially when I taught high school English and we did Shakespeare. It is so painful to read it. It's difficult because it was never meant to be read. It was meant to be seen. But I can't take all my kids to a play. So what did I do? I did bring in videos. So we would read short chunks of the text, and then, there's all sorts of famous Shakespearean plays turned into movies. So I could do a little bit of both. I really struggled with that because I thought, well, maybe I'm giving up. Maybe I'm being too lenient. Maybe I'm not being tough enough with my students and expecting them to go really, really far. the opposite happened. They were engaged with Shakespeare. They learned it. They got the ideas. They were exploring the thoughts. They were debating, what something meant because they saw it on screen. They could see, it made more sense because that's how it was intended to be portrayed. Of course, we read portions of it when we wanted to explore something more difficult. But I had to basically say, if I'm going to read this whole thing, I'm going to lose 99% of the kids. If we watch some of it on a video, yeah, I'm giving up some of the high-level expectations that I think kids should have. But everybody's engaged. What do I want more? I want them all to be engaged and to think through these ideas more completely. Grammar, that's a very difficult thing because there is a lot of research that shows that if we teach it very explicitly, we don't actually do anything to encourage its proper use. What does encourage proper use? Extensive reading and writing in a way where we get a chance to give feedback. And, for example, it's sort of an interplay. When you write something and you don't know, should I have used this verb or that verb? Or do I, what tense should I put a word in? But you just do something. But then you are an avid reader and you see it in print 4 or 5 times. You realize, okay, now I know, so I'll do it this way. That's how grammar best works. The only trouble is that's obviously not what's in the curriculum. We have to teach it. And so, I found this to be a very big challenge because I had the same problem, not to the extent that Sanoyama and so forth has it, but we still did have very strict standardized tests in the United States. And I realized that if I didn't teach these things explicitly, then my students would score poorly. And that, unfortunately, I have to say, was a dilemma that I still have not resolved. I think it's just as irresponsible to not give students the things they need to be successful on those exams as it is to make them successful in those exams. It's a horrible thing to feel because when we help them pursue that, we recognize that we're giving up other opportunities to create critical thinkers, creative citizens. But when we don't, we also deprive our students from being able to survive in society. And I think it's that's a challenge.
I want to know how can we measure the creativity on social science field and how we develop it to the researchers in the university.
Okay, so that's interesting. This is a really good example, I think. How do you measure creativity, and how, especially with researchers in the university, right? Researchers, how do you assess creativity in research? So when most of us know in research, the way that we achieve success is if we publish papers and we get lots of people to read our papers and people cite our papers and they're used in common society as the results and so forth. That seems like a very narrow way to think about creativity because, academic papers can be very, very boring. But this is a key thing. The fact that those academic papers are boring to read doesn't make them not creative or doesn't make it so that they can't be creative. I think what I found is that breakthrough ideas expressed through those papers, that's creativity, but it's accepted in a way that can be useful because it's in a convention that we expect. If we just decide instead of writing papers, we're going to, put something on YouTube, people unfortunately don't respect that. They don't accept that as being a valid way of presenting research, and so it doesn't get us very far. This is an odd way to think about this, but I mentioned at the beginning of this that Steve Jobs is somebody that we think of as being very creative as a technology entrepreneur. But if you look at the Apple computer, yes, it looks a little different from this Fujitsu, but the basic convention of it is exactly the same. you have two pieces that fold together and you have a screen, you have a keyboard. The reason I bring this up is that we can't always go completely out of the norm. With creativity doesn't take us so far out of the abnormal. It just usually gets us small improvements on things. And there's an interesting way to think about this. It's called dissemination research. And dissemination research looks at when we have a new product on the market that's innovative or creative, or we have a new technological innovation, how do we get it out there? How do we people, adopt it? And there's a lot of theories for this, but the most famous one is called the S-shaped curve. You have at the beginning of something, you have a group of people who automatically go for anything new and different, and that's a small group of people. And then you have, if they're successful at it, you have other people who see them do it, and they think, oh, that looks great. I think I'll do that. I'll buy that product. And then you have a lag until you get to all the other adopters later on. Let me make this more explicit. When did mobile phones come out? I think in the early 1990s or the late 1980s. I can't remember. But very, very few people had mobile telephones. And then it was really around 2000 or so, maybe a little bit before that, where everybody started buying mobile telephones. Now, I don't know a single person who does not have a mobile telephone. My daughters don't even know how to use a landline. They don't even know what it is. They think it's this little box that sits on the table, because we just don't have one. Why? Who has a landline these days? But it was my wife's parents. They're the people that wait really long time to adopt. They literally, just 2 years ago, the very first time, bought a mobile phone. I don't know how they've lived so long without it, but they have. I bring this up to say that what we do in research is we go through a series of people who adopt ideas and people who wait. People who adopt, people who wait. And the waiters look at the adopters and they make their judgments on, should I do this? Should I not do this? Is it helping them? Is it doing something good for them? Would it do something good for me? And over time, we have then, perhaps if it's a really successful innovation, like the wheel or the mobile telephone, everybody has it. Everybody does it. But it has to be done in a way that doesn't take us to such extremes, because people won't accept it. They won't adopt it. So we have to keep it within the frameworks of. Now, how do you measure it? I think it's just that. Is it a useful idea? Can you do something with it? Do people accept it? And that's the challenge, as I said, about restaurants. I've seen a lot of restaurants open up where I live that stay open for 2 months and then they go out of business. Why? Because people didn't think that innovative idea or that creative idea was useful. Others, they open up and people don't go for a while, and then, you hear people talking about it. Oh, it's a great restaurant, really good food, it's wonderful. And then you see it stay open longer, and it just took a longer time to get started. There are different ways that you see adoption of things, but the main point is if you go so far out of the norm, it's just going to fail no matter what, because people aren't going to use it. And that's the challenge, is that it still could be a good idea, and maybe 100 years later somebody will bring us back to it. But unless we are starting to use it, then I don't think it's not necessarily been successful.
First, I would like to thank you for the presentation, and I miss your lectures so much. Please don't stop writing articles. I read your last article about university rankings and how fallacious. So don't stop, because it was an eye-opener for me, and I guess for many others. I have two questions. What can academic culture learn from the corporate culture when it comes to creativity? Because actually when I read the word creativity, maybe Google would come up Apple and stuff like that? And the second question, please. How can our children find joy in being creative so their motivation would be intrinsic, and that would mean it would be lifelong reward? Thank you.
First of all, Mohammed is one of my former students, so I'm so happy to see you here. I really love this question. How can schools learn from corporations? Usually, I would be the first to say they can't and they shouldn't. that corporations are for profit and schools should be for learning and intrinsic value. But I actually do agree with you that there is an enormous amount that schools should be learning from companies, from corporations, from firms. For the most part, I would say that the main thing that schools and universities should be learning from companies is collaboration and communication and interdependence. At a school, this is an odd way to think about this, but look at an organization chart. You have the school leader, then you have a bunch of teachers. And each teacher is in a classroom by him or herself teaching students, sometimes with the door shut. The adults don't talk. They're not supposed to. They're supposed to be talking to the students. At companies, you have, let's say you're at a firm that creates a product. You have a marketing team who has to talk to the engineers, and the engineers have to talk to the buyers to buy the products. The accountants have to talk to the managers, and the managers have to talk to the human resources office. You have interdependence where people are forced to collaborate and think through things together. So you have greater reliance on making sure that ideas are not just thrown out there and people are on their own to think through every single thing. In a firm, we require, it's not even a choice. We have to collaborate. We have to communicate with each other or things just do not happen. Imagine the engineers and the marketers not talking. We all know engineers will go one way and the marketing people will go another way. And we will have something that doesn't work. I think that's unfortunately what we have in schools and universities. How do we create joy in creativity and a lack of reliance on the extrinsic motivators? I hate to say this is a very hard question to answer because I don't know. I have tried a lot of things in my teaching career. I have done things from, in fact, here's an interesting story. I went to a university. I started at a university that did not give grades. Instead, it gave written evaluations for every student in the class. So after 1 year, I have a whole stack of written evaluations from my professors. You know, early in the process, you would think, well, that's great. You don't have an A or a B that you have to worry about. You don't have to have, you know, levels of good and very good and so forth. You can just have a written evaluation. Unfortunately, this pile of papers was so specific and pointed out, I showed up late a couple times. I had papers that weren't very good, and this is why they weren't. It was more explicit. It was also more difficult to read because it was more specific. But I do think that it's impossible to do that for the most part because most of the time in schools and universities we have too many students. We can't do that. I've tried all sorts of things. I've tried thinking about, you know, having students negotiate for their grades. I've tried everything and nothing works because everybody's conditioned for, you know, I show up, I hear what you say, I read what you tell me to read, and I do what you tell me to do, and you are supposed to give me a grade. I gave up on experimenting with things, you know, a while ago, a number of years ago, because I realized that was not something I wanted to change that badly. So I gave up on that. So I still have to resort to, as a teacher myself, I still go back to giving grades the same way I've always given grades, the way that everybody else gives grades. But I do feel a slight pain in my heart because I recognize that sometimes the C student or the D student actually could have been an A student had there been other conditions present. Or perhaps a C student who tried really, really hard and just didn't get there might be turned off from the subject I'm teaching because they got a grade that they didn't want. My personal feeling is that it isn't necessarily through changing those external rewards. Sometimes we just have to give them. Obviously, if you run a company or if you employ people, you do want to respect hard workers by giving them increases in salary if you can. Why wouldn't you? People expect, to be able to make more money over the course of their careers. That's something that people need to survive and to be able to feel happy in their families and so forth. So my point is, it's not about changing the external things. It's about increasing the internal things. It's about saying we can balance both. We can still do the external things, but we will also try to engage people as much as we possibly can with the internal rewards. And the internal rewards, let's just face it, if we work at a company and we produce something, yes, we want more than a paycheck. We want to feel like we are contributing to something. Even if what we are ultimately contributing to is profit, we do want to be part of something. We care. We want to enjoy the companies we work for. And we want to engage with our colleagues and have our colleagues respect our ideas. And if they don't, we want to know why. So my point is, it's not about reducing the external rewards. It's really about increasing the intrinsic rewards. Sorry. Oh.
How could we achieve the balance between criticizing our children to do things correct and properly, and in the same time we don't like to discourage them from being creative?
I think I'm glad you asked that, because I realized as I was giving this that I should have been more specific when I said that the feedback that we give and the risks that children and students take, and the fear that we put in them about failure is really about the questions we ask and the way that we engage with them in terms of the process. And that's, I think, what I meant about focus on the process, not the product. It's because what we're inclined to think of is when we look at a product, what was done correctly or incorrectly? What was right or what was wrong? When we look at products, we have such black and white thinking, such polar opposite thinking. It was either done well or it wasn't done well. It served a need or it didn't. It solved a problem or it contributed to the problem. When we instead look at the process, we turn it around in terms of what worked and didn't work, what was good and bad, what was right or wrong, and we actually change the discussion to how did this idea come about? What made you think about doing it this way? Why did you choose this color? Why did you think about this product? Why did you consider this concept when you thought about this piece of literature? Why did you make this grammatical decision? As opposed to getting a piece of paper back with red marks all over it, all over the grammar, that's a right or wrong outcome. Why did you choose this word instead? What made you think about doing this? I think that's what I mean by this, is changing the focus from the product to the process. Then you focus on rationales, and you focus on how decisions are being made, because decisions are not being made all along as right or wrong processes. They're being constructed. And what we want to do is we want to engage the construction. We want to engage the process as opposed to judging the outcome. And I think if we can do that, if we can talk about why things were done, we'll engage. And to me, this goes back to the literature question. it's really great if, you know, a high school student knows all the characters in Romeo and Juliet. It's a famous play. If you know certain things, that's really important in certain social settings. But when you think about why a character did something in a play, or why an author portrayed a setting in a particular way, you're looking at choices. You're looking at decision-making processes. And I think that's what we want to focus on, is decision-making processes, not as right or wrong, but as things that we did to construct ideas. So I think there was one more question, and then there was one more right over here that he was.
Okay.
I'm studying.
I will go with him.
I'm sorry.
I'm studying engineering. I want to be creative in my field, but there is no one encourage me in my field. What should I do?
That's a really good question, because engineering is always the field that gets criticized for being having a lack of creativity. It's interesting, you know. Since I work at AUC, I'm gonna promote AUC a little bit. Our engineering students are actually, they get less engineering training because we require liberal arts. We require literature and art and philosophy and music and other courses. Cairo University students are also they turn out to be actually better engineers, I think, than most AUC engineers, because they have really in-depth engineering training. I think the thing that I like about AUC engineers, though, they may know a little less engineering than Cairo University students. They had less training. But they also, in being creative and being, given the chance to study different things, they are encouraged to question and to lead and to communicate and to value diversity and so forth. In some regard, I think those students have an easy time getting jobs because people want to hire people who are creative and innovative and so forth. I think it's not necessarily that you have to get people to accept your creativity. I think you just need to do it and to be articulate about what your ideas are. And it's very hard because of all those constraints that we talked about. But I do personally think that at the end of the day, most companies are looking for people to step up and be leaders and step up and be innovative and to think of new ideas. It's just that we're not only conditioned to not do that, we're fearful of doing it because we're fearful that we'll, break tradition. I say all this also fully recognizing that some of us will get fired for doing those things. And we have to be very cautious. And that's my point about, it's really nice and easy to talk about all these things, but we do live in real life, and real life, unfortunately, isn't that easy. So my only desire is that we all do it ourselves. So I just unfortunately have to say that there's not a whole lot we can do. What we can do is we can make sure we don't do that to other people. And I wish I had a better answer. Unfortunately, it's in us, and if we don't, when you become the manager of your entire firm and you are employing a lot of people, my hope is that you then change how people are treated in terms of their creativity. We all have to do that very deliberately. I think there's just time for one more question because I've been told that...
I'm a science and chemistry teacher, and in our school we are running projects with TLDW, and my project is based on how to motivate my students to read in their textbooks. And it's very difficult to let them read in science and chemistry books where they're asking about notes and short answers, and how to do the balance between taking the grades and grabbing the information. I found this is a very good opportunity to take your consultation. Please. Thank you.
This is really difficult because it's interesting. You were asking about research and how you identify good creative research. As much as I said that reading research papers is boring, I sometimes think research papers are less boring than textbooks. And the challenge is that textbooks are aimed at assimilating a huge amount of information into a small amount of space. When you think about what produces those textbooks, it's piles and piles of research papers that get summarized for student consumption. I unfortunately feel like, because I've been in the same position myself of having to force students, like I said about tests, sometimes you still have to do it because it's part of the curriculum. But on the other hand, sometimes it's about supplementing with other things or encouraging them to go elsewhere to look at other things. I face this with my own daughter. She takes science, and the textbook that she has is so terribly boring. She actually says that she wants to be a scientist, which I'm very excited about. And she reads on her own science books, but it's only because I've had to go out specifically and find things. And then unfortunately, to satisfy her desire for reading more, I have to find stuff online because I just can't go out and find enough elsewhere. The point that I'm making is, again, sometimes we have to do the things that we have to do in our schools, and we can't change that because we might put our students at risk. But we can also add or enhance it, and we can be honest. I think that's the other thing, is that as teachers, sometimes we're afraid to be honest with our students because we're afraid that they'll take too much away from that. If it were me, I'd say I get bored by reading science textbooks too, but we are going to do it for these following reasons. And as you all know, if you work in schools, a lot of students will read it because they feel compelled to. A lot of students won't. And I think the goal is to say, if something sparked your curiosity in this, I have other things you can go look at online, or another thing you can read, or things like that. It's really more of a matter of extending, not subverting, not saying we can't do this, we have to do the fun thing. Unfortunately, sometimes we have to do the not so fun thing. Well, unfortunately, I've been told there's no time left, but I will be here for additional questions, so I know there are a few more questions. Thank you so much. I really have enjoyed this opportunity to talk about this tonight.
Video of this lecture is available on our Facebook and what else? Is it Facebook? And our website, all right? And I also want to remind you, next month, inshallah, on May 25th, we have another lecture. It is about the access to knowledge, the heart of the development discourse. And you can please come and talk to Dr. Purinton as you like. Thank you for coming. Look forward to seeing you next month, inshallah.